The smell of antiseptic always reminded Lee Kang-dae of death, but tonight, in the hushed corridors of St. Jude's Hospital, it smelled like a trap. He stood motionless in the shadows of the doorway, his black leather trench coat blending into the gloom of the unlit hall. To the world, he was the untouchable heir to the Korean Syndicate, a man whose name silenced rooms. But here, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his mother's chest through a sliver of reinforced glass, he was merely a predator waiting for a strike. His gaze was fixed on Camille Thorne. She moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that unsettled him. Most nurses were hurried, their movements dictated by the shrill demands of pagers and charts. Camille was different. She was a ghost in light blue scrubs, her dark skin glowing under the soft hum of the cardiac monitors. Kang-dae watched as she leaned over Madame Lee, her hands, gentle yet firm, adjusting the oxygen mask with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Earlier that evening, Kang-dae had reviewed the duty roster. Camille Thorne wasn't supposed to be on this floor. She was a trauma nurse from the ER, yet here she was, 3 hours after her shift had ended, slipping into his mother's room like a thief in the night. Suspicion burned in his chest, hot and familiar. In his world, nobody did anything for free, and extra care was usually a prelude to a betrayal. He watched her reach into the pocket of her scrubs and pull out a small, unlabeled vial. His hand instinctively moved beneath his coat, his fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of his suppressed pistol. One wrong move, he told himself, and she wouldn't make it to the hallway. But Camille didn't inject the fluid into the foreline. Instead, she poured a few drops onto a clean cloth and began to gently massage his mother's swollen hands. She leaned down, her lips moving in a silent, rhythmic whisper, a prayer or perhaps a song, that didn't register on any medical chart. She stayed there for 20 minutes, performing tasks that no doctor had ordered, checking the temperature of the room, clearing a slight blockage in the drainage tube that the evening shift had missed, and watching the monitors with a focused intensity that surpassed even Kang-dae's own. As she turned to leave, she paused, looking toward the darkened hallway where he stood. Kang-dae held his breath, his back pressed against the cold wall, his heart drumming a steady war beat. She lingered for a moment, her expression unreadable, a mix of exhaustion and a strange, fierce protectiveness, before pulling her surgical mask back up and disappearing toward the service elevator. Kang-dae stepped out of the shadows, his eyes narrowed. He didn't know who Camille Thorne was working for, but he was certain of one thing. No one was this dedicated to a stranger without a reason. He would follow her. He would find her secret. And if she was the threat he suspected, he would ensure she was the last thing his mother ever had to fear. The rain in the district was never just rain. It was a deluge that turned the neon signs of the city into blurry smears of red and blue. 6 months ago, on a night that felt like the end of the world, Camille Thorne had been walking home from a grueling double shift. Her bones ached, and the damp cold of the city seemed to seep into her very marrow. She was taking the narrow shortcut behind the fish market, a place where the shadows were thick and the air smelled of salt and decay, when the silence of the night fractured. The sound was unmistakable to someone who worked in an urban ER, the sharp, rhythmic pop-pop-pop of suppressed gunfire, followed by the screech of tires on wet asphalt. Camille flattened herself against a soot-stained brick wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She waited, breathless, as a black sedan roared past the alley entrance, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a predator. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the steady drum of rain against metal. Then she heard it, a moan. It was a thin, high sound, the sound of someone losing their grip on life. Camille's internal compass, calibrated by years of trauma care, didn't point toward safety, it pointed toward the sound. She moved through the darkness, her sneakers splashing in the oily puddles, until she found the source. Behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, an elderly woman lay crumpled in the mud. She looked impossibly small, a bundle of expensive charcoal silk and silver hair. Even in the dim light, Camille could see the dark, spreading stain on the woman's side. "Stay with me," Camille whispered, dropping to her knees. Her scrubs were instantly soaked, the fabric clinging to her skin as the cold mud seeped into her clothes. She didn't have a medical kit, no sterile field, and no backup. She only had her hands and a fierce, stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. The woman's eyes were glassy, her breathing shallow and ragged. Camille's fingers flew over the woman's body, identifying the damage. A bullet had grazed her temple, but the real threat was a deep, jagged wound near her shoulder that was pulsing with every weakening beat of her heart. Camille didn't hesitate. She stripped off her own heavy cardigan, twisting it into a thick pad and pressing it down onto the wound with all her weight. The woman gasped, her frail hand clutching Camille's forearm with surprising strength. "I've got you," Camille murmured, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "Don't close your eyes. Look at me. Just look at me." Using the nursing shears she always kept in her pocket, Camille cut a strip of fabric from her own shirt to tie the pressure dressing in place. She worked with a cold, clinical speed, her mind blocking out the danger of the gunman, who might still be circling. She checked the woman's airway, tilted her head to keep her breathing clear, and whispered words of comfort that the rain swallowed whole. In the distance, the low rumble of high-performance engines echoed through the narrow passage. Headlights swept across the brickwork above them, growing brighter by the second. Camille froze. These weren't the sirens of an ambulance. This was the heavy, coordinated arrival of a private security detail. She looked down at the woman, whose pulse was now faint but stable. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle. Camille knew that being found here, with a high-profile victim of a syndicate hit, would mean a life of questioning or worse. She leaned close to the woman's ear, her breath warm against the cold rain. "You're going to be okay. They're here for you." Just as the first black SUV rounded the corner, Camille slipped into the deep shadows of a recessed service door. She watched from the darkness as men in tailored black coats spilled out, their movements disciplined and lethal. They found the woman, and for a terrifying moment, Camille feared they would finish the job. Instead, they moved with frantic, desperate reverence, lifting her as if she were made of glass. Camille vanished into the night before the men could scan the alley. She went home, scrubbed the blood from under her fingernails, and never told a soul. She didn't need a reward. She only needed to know that in a city built on taking lives, she had managed to save one. The sterile calm of St. Jude's Hospital was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon by the heavy thud of combat boots and the sharp, clipped commands of men who didn't belong in a place of healing. Camille was charting in the nurse's station when the air in the wing suddenly turned cold. A phalanx of men in tailored black suits swept through the double doors, creating a human corridor for a gurney that moved with frantic urgency. Camille stepped back, her pulse quickening. She had seen VIPs before, but this was different. This was an invasion. At the center of the storm was a young man with features like carved ice, his eyes scanning the hallway with a lethal, predatory intensity. Kang-dae. Even if she hadn't seen his face on the news, she would have known him by the way the hospital administrators bowed, their faces pale with a mixture of respect and sheer terror. As the gurney rushed past her toward the private suite in Ward 4, Camille caught a glimpse of the patient. Time seemed to stall, the frantic noise of the hospital fading into a dull roar. There, beneath the tangle of oxygen tubes and cardiac leads, was a face she had seen in her dreams for 6 months. The silver hair was neatly coiffed now, not matted with blood and rain, but the fine lines around the eyes and the small, jagged scar near the temple were unmistakable. It was her, the woman from the alley. Camille felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the edge of the laminate counter, her knuckles turning white. She had spent months wondering if the Jane Doe had survived, if her frantic, amateur surgery in the mud had been enough to hold back the dark. To see the woman here, identified as the matriarch of the most powerful crime syndicate in the country, felt like a collision of two worlds that were never meant to touch. She watched from a distance as Kang-dae stood outside the room, his hand resting on the doorframe, looking more like a sentinel than a grieving son. Camille knew she should step forward. She should tell the doctors about the previous trauma, the specific way the wound had closed, and the potential for internal scarring that might complicate her current cardiac crisis. But as she looked at the men guarding the perimeter, their hands twitching near their jackets, the words died in her throat. In her world, being a witness to a Mafia hit was a death sentence. If she revealed that she had saved Madame Lee that night, she would have to explain why she was there, what she saw, and why she had disappeared. She would become a variable in a world that only valued constants. Camille chose the shadows. She waited until the initial chaos subsided and the primary doctors had finished their rounds. When the shift changed and the hallways grew dim, she didn't go home. Instead, she stayed, slipping into the role of a silent guardian. She watched the monitors from the central hub, noting the slight irregularities in Madame Lee's heart rate that the automated alarms were too dull to catch. She became a ghost in Ward 4. When the assigned nurse was busy, Camille would slip into the room under the guise of checking supplies. She would adjust the pillows, ensure the foresight wasn't inflamed, and whisper the same steadying words she had used in the rain. She saw the way Kang-dae watched the room, his suspicion radiating off him like heat from a desert floor. He was looking for an enemy, a poisoner, a traitor. He was looking for someone who wanted his mother dead. He had no idea that the woman he was watching so closely was the only reason his mother was still breathing. Camille kept her head down, her mask high, and her secrets locked away. She was a nurse, not a hero, and in this hospital, the safest place to be was forgotten. The glow of the surveillance monitors in the darkened security office cast a ghostly blue light over Lee Kang-dae's sharp features. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes unblinking as they tracked the grainy, black-and-white feed of room 402. On the screen, Camille Thorne was moving through the small hours of the morning, her silhouette a flickering shadow against the clinical white of the hospital walls. Kang-dae didn't believe in the inherent goodness of people. In his world, a person was either a tool to be used, an obstacle to be crushed, or a threat to be eliminated. To him, Camille's presence in his mother's room was a mathematical impossibility that demanded a solution. She was too attentive, her movements too fluid, her care too deep for a woman who was supposedly a stranger. Find everything, he had told his tech specialist an hour ago. Every debt, every distant relative, every phone call she's made in the last 5 years. The report on his lap was frustratingly thin. Camille Thorne was a ghost of a different kind, a woman with no criminal record, no outstanding loans, and a reputation among the staff as a workhorse who preferred the silence of the night shift to the politics of the day. To a man like Kang-dae, a clean record wasn't a sign of innocence, it was a sign of a professional. A deep cover plant from the Japanese families or a local rival wouldn't have a record. They would look exactly like Camille, unremarkable, efficient, and invisible. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched Camille lean over the bed. She wasn't just checking the 4 bag. She was inspecting the insertion site with a magnifying glass she'd pulled from her pocket, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked like a bomb technician disarming a device, not a nurse doing a routine check. "What are you looking for, Camille?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He began to notice the patterns. She always entered the room exactly 4 minutes after the floor's head nurse finished her rounds. She never used the main service elevators, opting instead for the stairs, and she seemed to have an uncanny ability to stand in the blind spots of the hallway cameras, except for this one, a pinhole lens his men had installed secretly that afternoon. His suspicion shifted into something more visceral, a cold weight in his stomach. He watched as she reached out and took Madame Li's hand. For a long moment, she just held it, her head bowed. From this angle, it looked like a prayer, but Kang-dae saw it as a tactical assessment. Was she checking for a pulse, or was she waiting for the poison he was sure was being administered to take hold? The monitor flickered. Camille suddenly looked up, staring directly toward the hidden camera lens. For a heartbeat, Kang-dae felt as though she were looking into his very soul, her expression not one of guilt, but of a weary, defiant challenge. Then, as quickly as the moment had come, she looked away and continued her work, tucking the blankets around Madame Li with a tenderness that felt like a lie. Kang-dae stood up, his black trench coat swishing against his boots. He couldn't stay behind a screen any longer. The surveillance told him she was a spy, a highly trained operative waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of the Lee Syndicate. But his instincts, the raw, animal part of him that had kept him alive in the streets of Seoul, told him something else entirely. There was a secret buried in the way she touched his mother's skin, a history that predated this hospital wing. He stepped out into the hallway, the silent men in black suits stepping aside to let him pass. He didn't need a report anymore. He needed to put his hands on her, to look into her eyes without the filter of a camera and tear the truth from her. If she was a spy, he would break her. And if she was something else, something he couldn't yet name, he would find out why a woman with the hands of a healer was so comfortable walking among monsters. The silence of 3 a.m. in Ward 4 was a heavy, artificial thing, broken only by the rhythmic wheeze of ventilators and the distant hum of the ice machine. Lee Kang-dae moved through the corridors with the silent, predatory grace of a man who owned the night. He had waited for the precise moment Camille Thorne stepped away to the cafeteria, a rare 3-minute window in her otherwise relentless vigil. He slipped into the nurse's station, his gloved hands moving with practiced precision. He didn't check the digital records. He knew those were easily scrubbed or manipulated. Instead, he sought the physical remnants of her presence. He found it tucked behind a stack of generic medical journals in an obscure corner of the staff shelf, a worn, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed from constant use. Kang-dae opened it, expecting to find bank account numbers, contact names for rival syndicates, or perhaps a schedule of his mother's most vulnerable moments. What he found instead was a meticulous, handwritten map of a woman's struggle to survive. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, filled with annotations that didn't exist in the hospital's official database. There were hand-drawn diagrams of Madame Li's heart, with tiny, precise arrows pointing to a microscopic thickening of the arterial wall, a detail the chief of cardiology had dismissed as age-related. Camille had circled it in red ink with a single, chilling word next to it: regurgitation. As he flipped the pages, the air in Kang-dae's lungs turned to ice. He reached a section dated 6 months prior. There were no names, only a heading: Jane Doe, alleyway trauma. Beneath it was a sketch of a jagged wound near a shoulder. It wasn't a clinical drawing, it was a record of a battle. Camille had noted the exact angle of the entry, the specific tension of the sutures she had used, and a list of vitals that shouldn't have been recorded anywhere outside of a high-tech ER. Kang-dae's eyes narrowed as he compared the sketch to the faint, silvery scar he had seen on his mother's shoulder while the nurses changed her gown, a scar the hospital staff assumed was from a childhood accident. The notes continued into the present, detailing a subtle, fluctuating toxicity in Madame Li's blood levels that the standard labs weren't catching. Camille had tracked the spikes to the arrival of the afternoon shift's medication cart. She had even taped a small, clear plastic tab to the page, a seal from a vial that didn't match the hospital's approved suppliers. She wasn't spying on the family, she was spying on the hospital. Kang-dae felt a strange, jarring shift in his reality. For weeks, he had viewed Camille as the predator circling his mother's life. Now, looking at the sheer volume of unauthorized, life-saving data she had compiled, He realized she was the only one standing between his mother and a silent, clinical execution. A floorboard creaked behind him. Kang-dae didn't turn around. He closed the notebook and tucked it back into its hiding place, his mind racing. He had been looking for a reason to kill her, but these hidden pages gave him a much more terrifying reason to keep her alive. He stepped back into the shadows just as the elevator pinged, the heavy, rhythmic tread of Camille's sneakers approaching the station. He watched her through the glass as she returned to her post. She looked exhausted, the shadows under her eyes deepening in the harsh fluorescent light, yet she immediately reached for his mother's chart, her eyes scanning the data for the lies hidden in the numbers. Kang-dae realized then that he was no longer just watching a suspect. He was watching a woman who had been fighting his war for him, alone and in the dark, without ever asking for a cent of his blood-stained money. The suspicion was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a dark, burning curiosity. Why was a woman with the soul of a savior risking everything for the queen of a mafia empire? The hum of the hospital was different at 4 a.m, a lower, more sinister vibration that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the bones. Lee Kang-dae remained anchored in the shadows of the utility closet across from his mother's room, his presence a dark stain against the sterile, white hallway. He had seen the notebook. He had seen the evidence of Camille's silent war. Now, he wanted to see her in action. A junior nurse, a man named Park whom Kang-dae's intel team had flagged for recent, unexplained gambling debts, approached the room with a rolling medication cart. His movements were jerky, his eyes darting toward the security cameras with a frequency that screamed guilt. He hung a new 4-bag on the stand, adjusted the drip rate, and vanished back into the gloom of the hallway within 90 seconds. Kang-dae's grip tightened on the edge of the doorway. He was seconds away from stepping out and wrapping his wire around Park's throat when a familiar silhouette appeared from the opposite direction. Camille Thorne didn't walk. She moved with the intentionality of a soldier crossing a minefield. She didn't have a clipboard or a cart. She carried only a small, sterile tray with a single saline flush. She entered room 402 with the quiet grace of a shadow, but as soon as the door clicked shut, her demeanor shifted. Through the observation window, Kang-dae watched her eyes fly to the new 4-bag. She didn't check the patient's vitals first. She didn't even look at his mother. She walked straight to the 4-pole and gripped the plastic bag. She held it up to the light of the bedside monitor, her brow furrowing into a deep, sharp line of concentration. To a casual observer, she was checking for air bubbles. To Kang-dae, who had read her notes on unauthorized seals, it was clear she was looking for a puncture mark, a microscopic entry point where something lethal had been introduced into the medicine. She found it. Camille's jaw set into a hard, rigid line. She didn't call for the head nurse. She didn't hit the emergency button. She knew, as well as Kang-dae did, that in a hospital this compromised, an alarm was just a signal for the cleaners to come and finish the job. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a fresh, identical bag of heart medication, one she must have secured from the central pharmacy under a different patient's name hours ago. With a speed born of desperation and high-stakes experience, she clamped the line, swapped the bags, and tucked the poisoned one into a biohazard disposal wrap she had hidden on her tray. She worked with a clinical coldness, her hands steady despite the fact that she was effectively committing a felony to save a life. Just as she was priming the new line, Madame Lee stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips. Camille immediately dropped the professional mask. She leaned over the bed, her hand resting gently on the elderly woman's forehead. "It's okay, Madame Lee," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic contrast to the coldness of the room. "Just a small adjustment. You're safe. I'm right here." Kang-dae felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a child. He had spent his life surrounded by people who would kill for him, but he had never met someone who would risk their life to save his family for absolutely nothing in return. Camille finished the swap, wiped down the equipment to ensure no prints were left, and stepped back. She stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on the heart monitor as the clean medication began to flow. Only when the rhythm stabilized did she allow herself a single, shaky breath. She looked exhausted, a woman carrying the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders, unaware that the king was watching her from the dark. Kang-dae let go of his weapon. He didn't need it for her. As Camille stepped out into the hallway, looking left and right before slipping away, Kang-dae realized the truth. He wasn't the one protecting his mother in this hospital. He was just a spectator to a miracle in blue scrubs. But as he watched her disappear, his gratitude was quickly replaced by a cold, sharpened fury. He knew who had sent that bag. And now, thanks to Camille, he knew exactly how to find them. The break room was a cramped, fluorescent-lit purgatory that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial-grade floor wax. Camille sat at the scarred plastic table, her head in her hands, the adrenaline from the force swap finally curdling into a cold, bone-deep exhaustion. She had exactly 6 minutes before her next round, 6 minutes to pretend that she wasn't playing a lethal game of chess with invisible assassins. The door didn't creak. It simply ceased to be an exit. Camille looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Kang-dae stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the dim light of the hallway. In the confined space, his presence was suffocating. He looked less like a worried son and more like the Grim Reaper in a black leather trench coat. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched her with those sharp, obsidian eyes that seemed to strip away her professional mask until she felt utterly exposed. "You're far from your station, Nurse Thorne," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat that vibrated in the small room. Camille forced herself to take a steadying breath, her fingers curling around the cold paper cup of coffee. "I'm on my break, Mr. Lee. Even nurses need to breathe." He took a step forward, the heavy soles of his boots sounding like a death knell on the linoleum. He didn't stop until he was looming over her, the scent of expensive cologne and cold rain clinging to his coat. He leaned down, placing his hands on the table, effectively trapping her between his arms. "Most nurses spend their breaks resting. You spend yours stealing medication, hacking into proprietary files, and keeping a very interesting little notebook." The blood drained from Camille's face. She tried to stand, but he didn't budge, his physical presence an immovable wall. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I was correcting a mistake?" Kang-dae interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw you swap the bag, Camille. I saw the way you handled that tainted for as if you've handled poison a dozen times before." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver lighter, flicking it open and shut with a rhythmic, metallic clack. "My men found the nurse who delivered that bag. He's currently explaining his gambling debts to my associates. But you're a much more difficult puzzle to solve." Camille looked up at him, her fear suddenly spiked with a flash of defiance. "If I hadn't swapped that bag, your mother would be in cardiac arrest right now. Is that what you want? To be right? Or to have a living mother?" Kang-dae's expression didn't soften, but his eyes narrowed, searching hers for a flicker of a lie. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "I want to know why a woman who has no ties to my family, no reason to love a woman like Madame Lee, is risking a prison sentence or a bullet to save her. Nobody is that selfless. Not in this city." He reached out, his gloved thumb brushing the pulse point on her neck, feeling the frantic, rabid thump of her heart. "And then there's the matter of a rainy night 6 months ago. An alleyway. A woman left for dead." Camille froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "The hospital records say she arrived in an ambulance," Kang-dae continued, his voice dangerously soft. "But my mother's coat was mended with a very specific type of surgical silk. The same silk I found in your locker tonight." He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "You saved her twice. Once in the mud and once tonight. Tell me, Camille Thorne, who are you working for?" Because if it isn't me, and it isn't my enemies, then I have to wonder what you're really waiting for. Camille met his gaze, her voice trembling but clear. I'm not waiting for anything, Mr. Lee. I'm a nurse. I save people. Even the ones surrounded by monsters like you. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, a taut wire ready to snap. For a long, silent moment, Kang-dae didn't move. Then, he straightened up, the predatory intensity in his eyes shifting into something darker, something more complex. He didn't apologize, but he stepped back, giving her the space to breathe. The hospital isn't safe for you anymore, he said, turning toward the door. They know you interfered. From this moment on, you don't move without my shadow. You saved her life twice, Camille. That makes you the most valuable thing I own. The flatline was a jagged, piercing sound that murdered the silence of Ward 4. It wasn't the rhythmic beat of a struggling heart, but the long, hollow scream of a machine announcing a departure. Camille didn't wait for the code blue to be called. She didn't wait for the crash cart or the resident on duty who was likely 3 floors away. She was moving before the sound had even registered in Lee Kang-dae's mind, her exhaustion replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. She burst into room 402, the door swinging back with a violent thud against the wall. Behind her, Kang-dae followed, his hand hovering over his weapon, his face a mask of sudden, paralyzing dread. He had spent his life dealing in death, but as he looked at his mother's pale, graying face and the green line that had turned into a horizon of nothingness, the most powerful man in Seoul realized he was utterly helpless. Get back, Camille snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the monitors. She looked only at the woman on the bed. She ripped the blankets back, her hands moving with a speed that blurred in the dim light. Madame Lee's chest wasn't moving. Camille climbed onto the bed, straddling the elderly woman's legs, and began compressions. The rhythmic thump-crack of ribs beneath her palms was a sound that would have sickened a lesser person, but to Camille, it was the only music that mattered. Call the station, she yelled over her shoulder. Tell them it's an acute anaphylactic shock, the secondary reaction to the tampering. Move. Kang-dae, a man who gave orders to thousands, found himself obeying a nurse. He bellowed for his men, his voice echoing down the hall like a wounded animal. But as he turned back to the room, he saw Camille reach for a tray of emergency supplies. She didn't wait for a doctor to authorize an intubation. She grabbed a large-bore needle, her eyes narrowed, and positioned it over his mother's throat. What are you doing? Kang-dae's voice was a low, desperate growl. He stepped toward the bed, his instincts screaming that she was about to deliver a killing blow. Her airway is closing. If I don't do this, she's gone in 60 seconds. Camille didn't hesitate. She plunged the needle into the cricothyroid membrane. There was a sickening hiss of air, a sound like a punctured tire, and then, the most beautiful sound Kang-dae had ever heard, a ragged, whistling gasp of breath. Camille didn't stop. She began pushing a syringe of epinephrine directly into the 4-line she had secured earlier. Her face was drenched in sweat, her high bun beginning to unravel, stray hairs sticking to her forehead. She was a woman possessed, a warrior fighting an invisible enemy with nothing but plastic and steel. The monitor chirped. A single, weak blip appeared on the screen. Then another. The flat line fractured, turning back into a mountain range of life. Camille collapsed back against the headboard, her chest heaving, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the bed railing to keep from falling. She stayed there, hovering over Madame Lee like a guardian angel who had just returned from the gates of hell. Kang-dae stood in the center of the room, his breath hitched in his throat. He looked at the monitors, then at his mother, whose color was slowly, miraculously returning. Finally, his gaze settled on Camille. He saw the blood on her scrubs, his mother's blood. He saw the raw, unfiltered terror in her eyes, and the quiet, fierce triumph that lay beneath it. He had spent millions on the best doctors in Asia, on security details that could stop an army, and on technology that could see through walls. Yet, in the end, his mother's life had hung by a single thread, and that thread was held by a woman he had threatened only minutes before. For the first time in his life, Kang-dae felt the crushing weight of a debt he could never repay with money or blood. He looked at Camille, and the suspicion that had defined his life for 30 years finally began to crumble, replaced by a stunned, terrifying reverence. "You saved her," he whispered, the words feeling heavy and foreign in his mouth. Again, Camille didn't look up. She just took Madame Li's hand and held it, her touch as gentle as it had been when she thought no one was watching. "That's what I do," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't let people die." The red emergency lights began to pulse, turning the sterile room into a rhythmic, blood-colored cage. The hum of the hospital's heavy machinery died, replaced by a silence so sudden it felt like a physical blow. Kang-dae didn't need his radio to tell him what was happening. He had felt the shift in the air, the subtle vibration of heavy footsteps that didn't belong to nurses, and the muffled thwack of a silenced pistol from the floor below. The breach was here. Kang-dae stepped away from the bed, his hand already deep inside his leather trench coat. He didn't look at the door. He looked at Camille. She was still holding his mother's hand, her eyes wide as she tracked the red strobing light across the ceiling. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply looked at the monitors, watching the battery backup power kick in, ensuring the life support didn't falter. "Stay low," Kang-dae commanded, his voice a rasp of pure steel. "Under the bed. Do not move unless I tell you." "I can't," Camille whispered, her voice trembling but fixed. "If she shifts, the needle I just placed will pull. She'll bleed out before your enemies even reach the door. I have to hold the site." Kang-dae's jaw tightened. He had seen soldiers freeze under less pressure, yet this woman was refusing to hide because of a hematoma risk. He kicked the heavy bedside table in front of her, creating a makeshift barricade. "Then stay behind this. If anyone but me opens that door, you keep your head down." Outside in the hallway, the sound of the elevator doors being forced open echoed through the ward. It was followed by the heavy, synchronized tread of a hit squad, his fiercest rivals. They weren't here for a conversation. They were here to decapitate the Li family while their queen was weak. The first of them appeared in the observation window, a man dressed as an orderly, but carrying a submachine gun with a drum magazine. He didn't hesitate. A burst of fire shattered the reinforced glass, raining diamonds of light across the room. Kang-dae was faster. He leaned out from the shadows of the doorway, his own weapon barking 3 times in rapid succession. The orderly crumpled, his body sliding down the wall as a dark smear followed him. There in the vents and the service stairs, Kang-dae muttered, reloading with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. He looked back at Camille. She was hunched over the bed, her body shielding Madame Li, her hands still locked on the injection site. A shard of glass had grazed her cheek, a thin line of red marring her skin, but she didn't even flinch. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, had become a kill zone. For Kang-dae, this was home, a world of shadows and lead. But for Camille, it was a nightmare. Yet, as the smoke from the gunfire began to swirl in the red light, she looked up at him. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a fierce, desperate demand. "Save her," she said, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. "I did my part. Now you do yours." Kang-dae felt a surge of something more potent than adrenaline. He wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was fighting for the woman who refused to leave her side. He stepped into the center of the room, a titan in black leather, facing the door as more shadows began to gather in the hall. The world outside might be falling apart, but within the 4 walls of room 402, a nurse and a Mafia boss were the only things keeping death at bay. The air in the room was a thick cocktail of ozone, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. The strobe of the red emergency lights pulsed like a failing heart, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Kang-dae backpedaled into the room, his black leather trench coat tattered and stained with the debris of the hallway skirmish. He slammed the heavy door shut and kicked the manual lock, but he knew the reinforced wood was only a temporary barrier against the tide of lead waiting on the other side. He turned to Camille, his eyes wild and dark. "I'm down to my last magazine," he rasped, his breath heavy and strained. "If they breach that door together, I can't stop them all while guarding your flank." Camille didn't flinch. She had spent the last 3 minutes securing Madame Lee to the bed frame with high-tensile medical tape, preparing for a move that seemed impossible. She looked at the tray of supplies she had scavenged: scalpels, concentrated saline, and a heavy canister of medical-grade oxygen. "Then don't guard my flank," she said, her voice a low, steady hum of adrenaline. "Direct them to the kill zone." She pointed to the entryway, where she had overturned a cart of antiseptic and surgical lubricant, turning the floor into a treacherous, slick trap. She had also rigged the bedside monitor's electrical cables across the threshold, a crude but effective tripwire charged with enough voltage to stop a man in his tracks. Kang-dae looked at her, a slow, grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're a dangerous woman, Camille Thorne." "I'm a nurse," she corrected, her fingers tightening around a heavy metal pole she had fashioned into a makeshift staff. "We're trained to anticipate every possible complication." The door exploded. 2 men in tactical gear burst through the splintering wood, their boots sliding instantly on the lubricated floor. As they struggled for balance, Kang-dae emerged from the shadows like a vengeful god, his pistol barking in the tight space. But a third man, swifter and more cautious, aimed his rifle directly at the bed, at Madame Lee. Camille didn't think. She didn't have time to pray. She grabbed the oxygen canister and threw it with everything she had. It didn't hit the man, but it forced him to flinch, his shot going wide into the ceiling. In that split second of distraction, Camille swung the heavy pole, the steel head connecting with the man's temple with a sickening thud. She stood over the fallen assassin, her scrub splattered with a new shade of red, her chest heaving. Kang-dae moved past her, clearing the remaining threats in the hall with a cold, surgical precision that matched her own. When the silence finally returned, it was heavier than before, thick with the weight of what they had just done together. Kang-dae leaned against the wall, his gaze traveling from the bodies on the floor to the woman standing guard over his mother. The divide between them, the line between the healer and the killer, had blurred into a single, bloody shade of survival. He saw her not as a nurse or a stranger, but as his equal. "We need to move her," Camille said, her voice finally breaking with the onset of shock. She didn't look at the carnage. She looked at the monitor. Her heart rate is spiking. "We're out of time." Kang-dae nodded, his expression softening into something resembling true respect. "Then we move. Together." He stepped toward the bed, his hand reaching out to steady Camille's shaking arm. In that moment, the Mafia boss and the nurse were no longer on opposite sides of the law or the light. They were the only 2 people left in a world gone mad, bound by a debt written in blood and a promise kept in the dark. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of a private, fortified medical wing, a stark contrast to the red-tinted nightmare of the previous night. The air no longer smelled of gunpowder, it smelled of lavender and fresh linen. Madame Lee lay in a state-of-the-art recovery suite, her breathing deep and even, a testament to the miracle Camille Thorne had performed with nothing but a needle and a steady hand. Lee Kang-dae stood by the window, his black leather trench coat finally shed, revealing the dark navy vest beneath. He looked older, the lines of tension around his eyes etched deeper by the realization of how close he had come to losing everything. He watched Camille as she moved around the bed, her movements still efficient, still quiet, though her light blue scrubs were now clean and crisp. She was checking the monitor, her eyes fixed on the steady, rhythmic wave of his mother's heart. I've spent my life believing that every debt can be paid in blood or currency, Kang-dae said, his voice low and devoid of its usual predatory edge. He turned to face her, holding a thick, manila envelope. I had my men dig deeper. Not into who you work for, but into who you are. Camille didn't look up from the monitor. I told you who I am. I'm a nurse. You're more than that, Kang-dae countered. He stepped forward, laying the envelope on the bedside table. You've been paying for the medications of elderly patients in Ward 4 out of your own pocket for 3 years. You've worked double shifts to cover for nurses with families, and you've never once filed for overtime. And then there is the matter of a rainy alleyway 6 months ago. He paused, his gaze softening. You didn't just save her life twice, Camille. You saved her dignity. You saved her without knowing she was the mother of a man who could give you the world, or a man who could take it away. He pushed the envelope toward her. Inside were the deeds to a fully funded, independent community clinic in the heart of the city, a place where she could practice without the interference of corrupt administrators or the fear of syndicate wars. It was a gift that mirrored her own selflessness, a sanctuary of healing. Camille finally looked at him, her expression guarded. I didn't do it for a clinic, Mr. Lee. I didn't do it for you. I know, he replied, and for the first time, a genuine, albeit small, smile touched his lips. That is why you are the only person I trust to run it. As Camille looked down at the documents, she realized that the shadow in the hallway was gone. The man who only understood power had finally learned the weight of a different kind of strength. He walked toward the door, pausing one last time. My shadow stays with the clinic, he said. Not to watch you, but to ensure that no one ever interrupts your work again. The story of Camille Thorne and Lee Kang-dae is a reminder that true heroism is rarely found in the loud, grand gestures of the powerful. It is found in the quiet, thankless labor of those who choose to do the right thing when they believe no one is watching. Quiet heroism is the backbone of a civilized world. It is the nurse who stays after her shift, the stranger who stops in the rain, and the heart that gives without asking for a receipt. We must never mistake silence for weakness or service for subservience, for it is often the quietest among us who hold the power to snatch life from the jaws of death.